Throughout the Second World War, there were a number of sadistic men and women who got their hands dirty and inflicted incredible torture and suffering onto so many. Inside of concentration camps or prisons, these brutes sometimes even tortured to death. The terror that they inflicted led to them developing a reputation for themselves which they would never shake, and as the Second World War came to an end, many of these men were hunted for their crimes. In this documentary, we look at 5 of these men who were executed for their brutality, and we look at how vengeance eventually caught up with them. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Arthur Neber was born in Berlin in November 1894, and he would volunteer to see action during the First World War. Following the conflict, he then became a member of the Criminal Polizei, or the Kripo, the criminal police in Berlin. He rose throughout the ranks, assessing crime in the city for a number of years, but his political beliefs saw him embrace a shift in politics in Germany, when Adolf Hitler and Nazism rose to prominence. But Neber then joined the Nazi Party, and he then became a member of the SS, but he was the main link with the Nazis and the criminal police in Berlin. He, along with other Nazi detectives, formed the National Socialist Civil Service Society of the Berlin Police, and as time went on, they gained further recognition inside the Nazi Party, and Neber became the head of the Prussian criminal police. However, he then became the head of the Reich Criminal Police Office, and was answerable to Reinhard Heydrich, and Neber helped to found the Nazi police state and instigate it. But then Himmler, in September 1939, created the Reich Security Main Office, encompassing all the security and intelligence services, including secret groups and the criminal police. Neber was now high-ranking in this, and he had the powers of arrest and detention, and the Kripo under his command operated like the Gestapo, rounding people up and sending them to concentration camps, and he was also responsible for torturing individuals heavily. But then he was also involved in the Action T4 mass killing program, in which thousands were killed inside a number of extermination centres across Germany. But as the Second World War was ongoing across Europe, before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Neber was given command of Einsatzgruppe B, the Nazi death squads that would massacre thousands following advances by the German army. They were responsible for the killings of thousands, and they would shoot innocent people after forcing them to dig their own graves. Arthur Neber continued to command this group, and he set up his headquarters, and the mass executions of innocent people continued. His troops were shooting hundreds of people each day, and Neber claimed one day, following being let down by the amount of people his men killed, that I gave orders to intensify these activities, resulting in more executions. Neber realised that the Einsatzgruppen's killing capacity was not good enough though, and he then went to Heinrich Himmler to discuss other ways of killing instead of mass shootings. He was concerned about the mental health of his executioners and men, having to kill dozens each day, but Himmler asked Neber to come up with a solution and find a convenient way of killing. They believed using carbon monoxide was initially not good enough, and Neber was then given a group of Soviet psychiatric patients to experiment with. Near to Minsk, he tried to kill them using explosives, and it was said that one of the bunkers was loaded with explosives and 24 mental patients were put into it. Neber gave the signal to detonate, but the resultant explosion failed to kill the patients. Several of them emerged from the bunker, covered in blood and screaming loudly. Thereupon more explosives were brought in, the wounded patients were forced back into the bunker, and a second loud explosion finally finished the job. The bunker had become quiet, and parts of bodies could be seen hanging from nearby trees. It was horrifying, but then one evening Neber fell asleep in his car after driving home drunk, and he almost died from carbon monoxide poisoning after he parked his car in his garage. But then the experiments continued using gas, and Neber considered making gas vans to carry out the killings of dozens. He was very senior in the SS, and many high-ranking Nazis were good friends with Arthur Neber. But he spoke at the Mogilev conference, and he then spoke about the SD's involvement in fighting partisans during the war, and he also spoke about continuing to suppress resistance using brutality. Following his speech, instruction was given to German soldiers and all the police groups to increase the persecution and atrocities against civilians. But while still being in control of Einsatzgruppe B, Neber promoted his men to use mass hangings to terrorise the locals. He would hang many men who were considered partisans in front of huge crowds, and it's believed that his group were responsible for at least 50,000 people's executions. But after he came back to Berlin, Arthur Neber remained the head of the Kripo, even after his friend Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated. He then took on the post of the president of the International Criminal Police Commission, which today is known as Interpol. However, he would continue throughout the Second World War to use his powers to torture and execute many people inside of Germany and outside. His men would torture and interrogate brutally, with them even turning on women who would be brutalised if they did not give over any information. Many of these women were marked as lost causes, and were then executed by Neber's officers or other Wehrmacht soldiers. But one of his most notorious actions came in March 1944, as dozens of prisoners had escaped from Stalag Luft 3 in what is known as a Great Escape. These airmen had escaped by tunnelling under the barbed wire fences and making a run for it in the forests. Neber was ordered by the chief of the Gestapo to compile a list of 50 of the 73 escaped and recaptured prisoners, and his men were then ordered to shoot these prisoners discreetly and to then deal with their bodies. Many were taken into the forests and were shot quietly, but Neber then continued to be involved in death and execution, as he suggested that the Roma people held inside of Auschwitz should be used for medical experiments and at other camps such as Dachau. However, at some point, Arthur Neber became involved in an act of resistance against Hitler and the Nazi hierarchy that became infamous. The July 20th plot, or the Stauffenberg plot, saw a high-ranking German soldier plant a bomb inside of Hitler's Wolf's Lair that exploded. Hitler was injured but not severely, and the plot then was a way of seizing control of Germany again, and the coup would have seen Hitler's death, along with other members of his government. This plot ultimately failed, but Arthur Neber was roped into it and was tasked with leading a group of 12 policemen who would then apprehend Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and they would then execute him. But the order to act and do this never came, and when the plot failed, Neber went into hiding. He was arrested in January 1945 and was then sentenced to death by the People's Court on the 2nd of March 1945, months before the war came to an end. However, Arthur Neber's execution would be one which was absolutely brutal. Adolf Hitler would order the executioners to take the executions inside the execution chamber of Plötzensee prison. There was a guillotine there and also a hanging beam, and it would be on the wooden beam that Neber would meet his end. He was brought into the chamber after being beaten heavily, and for his treason he was then to be hanged. However, it would be with piano wire, as Hitler ordered the bomb plotters to be hanged like cattle. This wire was incredibly sharp, and Neber was lowered slowly, so he started to suffocate, and it was a truly horrible way to go. Many historians have a negative view of Arthur Neber due to his actions with the Einsatzgruppen, and the fact he was responsible for the deaths of thousands, and also the torture of thousands. Despite the fact he was part of the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, which would have ended the war, he was seen as an opportunistic mass murderer who wanted to inflict more murder by being involved in the plot. Others have claimed that Neber was a professional policeman and was a very mild Nazi, who may have even falsified the records of the Einsatzgruppen, greatly inflating the numbers of killed. However, what cannot be disputed is the fact he was a brutal and barbaric man, who did, in his role as the head of the criminal police, inflict a huge degree of suffering. But inside of an execution chamber at Plötzensee prison, he was subjected to a horrific execution on the hanging beam. Andras Kun was born on the 8th of November 1911, and as a young man he attended a seminary in Rome. He would train then as a priest in a Franciscan monastery, and it was clear he was a very devoted and religious young man. However, this Hungarian priest would then in 1943 for some reason be expelled from the monastery, and he then went back to Hungary, and he moved to Budapest. He had in the past given many different sermons and masses, and he would preach inside of the churches in Hungary. However, he would then become more politically motivated once he was back in Hungary. In 1944, Andras became a member of the pro-Nazi Arrow Cross Party, and this was a far-right ultranationalist party led by Ferenc Szalasi, and they would be involved in the government from October 1944 to March 1945. During its short time in power, they would slaughter between 10 to 15,000 civilians, including many Jews, and it's believed that they deported around 80,000 people from the country to concentration camps. The Arrow Cross Party's beliefs were very similar to the Nazis and the fascists. They were very anti-Semitic. Before the German invasion of Hungary in March 1944, Kun decided to devote his time to the Arrow Cross Party, and he would then take part in the seizure of power, and he would be involved in distributing weapons to other members. He said that the propaganda drilled into us the belief that the Jews lurked behind the Bolsheviks. Amidst the wildest battles I stood with this conviction, and as Jews came before me I beat them. The Germans would help the Arrow Cross Party gain power, as they took Regent Horthy into protective custody and forced him to abdicate. Selassie was then made the leader of the Hungarian nation and the Prime Minister of the government. The Arrow Cross rule would be brutal, with mass slaughter occurring across the nation, despite the fact that the Soviets were already within Hungarian borders and were fighting the Germans. Adolf Eichmann worked with the officers of the party to restart deportations of Jews from Budapest, and most of them were sent to camps such as Auschwitz and were exterminated as soon as they got there. The Arrow Cross Party and the SS would continue to exterminate the Jews of Hungary, and deportations continued, as well as using death squads, who would attack in the war zones similarly to how the Einsatzgruppen would slaughter civilians following military advances. Andras Kun then commanded an Arrow Cross detachment death squad in a district of Budapest, following Ferenc Szalasi leaving Budapest as he believed the city would be besieged by the Soviet Red Army. Andras's death squad would then slaughter and massacre Jews or any civilian who were hiding. During these attacks, he would often dress in priest robes and his cassock, as well as his Roman collar, showing that he was a priest. He would then wear his Arrow Cross armband and his holstered pistol. He would then order his soldiers in the name of Christ fire, claiming that he was doing God's bidding, slaughtering dozens of innocent people. He would later say, "I always wanted to reduce human misery and suffering. This is why I fought against the Jews. They are the lords of capital. The Jews were always the ones to walk on the sunny side of the street." In January 1945, he ordered the arrest of a well-known Jewish author and his family, and Kun and his executioners then tortured his son and wife. They were then taken to the Arrow Cross headquarters, where they were stripped and tied together and beaten. Around midnight they faced the firing squad, but amazingly their son survived 4 bullets and later made it out of Hungary. On the 12th of January 1945, Kun's death squad broke into a Jewish hospital in Maros Street, and 149 patients and doctors were then shot by him and his men. He then went to another hospital and shot another 100 dead. His death squad also entered sheltered housing and abducted 500 Jews, who were all lined up on the banks of the Danube River before Kun gave the order to shoot. Further attacks took place when the men broke into a sanatorium, slaughtering 100 more. When the siege of Budapest occurred, he did not flee the city, but continued to attack and massacre. Many of the bridges were exploded to prevent escape, and Kun helped a lot of war criminals escape to Buda, and he then continued to carry out his brutal actions. But even the Arrow Cross government officials became fed up with his crimes, as he would attack buildings under their protection of neutral countries, and on the 18th of January 1945, a police patrol was ordered to arrest him. But Andras then turned the tables on them, and he arrested the police, and beat their commanders terribly and locked them in a basement. His headquarters were then surrounded, and it was said if he did not give himself up in 10 minutes, the authorities would attack the building. Andras Kun handed himself over, and for 3 months he had rampaged across Budapest. Andras Kun had been arrested, and he was then brought to trial. The National Calling of Account Department charged him with specific crimes. One said that, on the 18th of January 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Rezo Mindak was severely beaten and later arrested, and Kun abused a section of police officers in the party house. He was then accused of being involved in the murders of around 3,000 people, but this was all going on whilst the Second World War was still waging on. He would be spared from execution during the war initially by Ferenc Szalasi, who commuted his sentence to 15 years in prison, but then when the Soviets captured the city, Andras Kun was released from prison by the guards as they did not know the monster that he was. He went missing for some months, and it's believed pretended to be Romanian, and he then left the scene of his crimes to travel on to Italy, possibly to pick up the priesthood again. But then on the Hungarian side of the Italian border, he was captured on the 3rd of August 1945 and the border guard transported him back to Budapest around 4 weeks later to stand trial, yet again for his crimes. He was brought in front of the Hungarian People's Tribunal, and he was then tried for the murder of 500 people. The true death toll of Andras Kun and his death squad, it's believed, is more, but let's not forget that in the years during the war, he was a priest. He was tried and was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as the slaughter and massacre of innocent people during the deadliest conflict the world has ever seen. He was interviewed on the day of his execution, and he would state when accused of sadism, "This perversion exists in a dormant state in every soul." When asked if it existed in his soul as well, Kun responded, "If it did, then it was dormant. I was not conscious of it." He would also admit in interviews that he did beat the Jews, but he continued to deny that he ever killed anyone, and he said he would be wrongly sentenced to death. He even claimed that he was a victim. However, on the 19th of September 1945, he was brought to Budapest for his execution. He was executed by the pole hanging method and was brought to the stake inside the city and was led up to the step. He had a rope passed around his body and his arms and legs were secured, before an executioner who was stood on a ladder secured a noose around his neck. Minutes later, as the crowd looked on through windows, the drop was released, and in minutes the killer priest of Budapest was executed, bringing his reign of terror to an end. It is not every day that you write a video on a killer priest who executed and slaughtered hundreds of people, leading a death squad. Andras Kun was a brutal and barbaric man who was involved in the massacres of many people as the government supported by Hitler took control in Hungary. Even when they fell from power, Andras would go on the rampage. He was a man who was sick and twisted and was a terrible war criminal who was taken to an execution stake for his crimes. Pietro Koch was born on the 18th of August 1918, and his father was an officer in the Imperial German Navy, and he was born in Benevento. He was a lieutenant in the Grenadiers after he enlisted in the Italian Royal Army in 1939. However, he did not get on very well. Pietro was eventually sacked from the army, as he would insult and defy a superior officer, but then as the Second World War broke out, Mussolini would ally himself with his close friend Adolf Hitler. Because of this, Italy and the Nazis were allied together in the Axis alliance, and the Italians would be heavily involved in many campaigns of the Second World War, including even in Africa. But Pietro Koch was then called back into the army on the eve of the war, as Italy needed as many men as possible. But regardless of his previous discipline issues, Pietro saw service with the Italian army until the armistice with the Allies was signed in September 1943, but following this he then moved to Florence. Pietro then established himself in the Italian Social Republic in the north, which would later be led by Mussolini after Hitler placed him in control of the Nazi puppet state, following being freed by the Germans in the Gran Sasso raid. But then he joined the special service of the Republican police, which at the time were being led by Tullio Tamburini. But Pietro Koch would go further, as he would then establish a group of paramilitaries which would become notorious for their brutality and their actions. He established a Banda Koch, which was a special task force which would hunt down partisans inside of the Italian Social Republic. They would then hand over partisans to the Germans, where they were threatened with torture, incarceration inside a concentration camp, and even execution. The partisans in Italy had emerged as an anti-fascist movement and organisation, and they opposed the establishment of the Nazi puppet state in the north, and they also hated Mussolini. It would be partisans who would fight against Italian fascists, and they were the ones who executed Mussolini when he was later captured. Pietro Koch's group of men would be protected by the SD in Rome, and in particular by Herbert Kappler, the chief of the SD. He was colluding with the Nazis to defeat their enemies, and he was allowed free rein to do whatever he wanted with partisans, and because of this, Koch developed a reputation for being a brutal torturer. He did whatever he wanted, and Banda Koch were known for their cruelty, and their reputation spread within the partisans. He was even allowed to use his own prisons to hold them, and he also utilised torture chambers, trying to gain information and more info and intel from his captives. He wanted to bring down the partisans completely, and he used different torture methods to get this information. But he was also responsible for murder and execution, and it was believed that Pietro was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of partisans. He was a violent extremist, and there were others he was working with and collaborating with, including police chief Pietro Koch, but he was a man who was greatly feared. The Italian Social Republic were concerned about his brutality, and they even granted an amnesty for political prisoners inside of the prisons who were not charged with murder. This was because the authorities worried that Pietro would wade into the prisons and would carry out more executions without any questions being asked. He was operating in a similar way as established brutes and organisations such as the SS and Heinrich Himmler would work, quietly carrying out executions. But as mentioned, Benito Mussolini even feared that Pietro Koch was a savage, and even the former fascist dictator of Italy was scared of him, and was greatly intimidated by his actions and also his group of soldiers. Mussolini was worried that at some point he would be taken prisoner in a power play by Pietro Koch to seize control, and Mussolini feared being held captive inside of one of his prisons. In fact, Mussolini even spoke with his close friend and ally, Renzo Montagna, about what to do with Pietro. They came up with a plan, and Montagna then arrested Pietro Koch for his involvement in brutal crimes, and with this Pietro was rounded up, along with a number of his officers, and he was held in prison. In October 1944, Mussolini had him locked up, as he was ultimately worried, intimidated and scared by him, but he was then charged with brutality and crimes which were considered too much and were also considered very unnecessary. But then, as the war was turning greatly at this time against the Italians, the Allies, following the invasion of Sicily, were advancing north throughout the country quickly. They seized Rome and then Florence, and with this they rampaged into the Italian Social Republic, and Mussolini then went on the run before he was briefly captured. However, Pietro Koch then also fell into the hands of the Allies, and it's not known if the Allies realised the nature of his crimes. However, he was then handed over to an Italian tribunal to assess whether he was guilty or not. He was charged and convicted of 6 different offences relating to the murder and torture of partisans, and for this he was sentenced to death. On the 4th of July 1945, Pietro Koch was taken to Rome, and specifically to Fort Bravetta, and he was to be executed by a firing squad. He was joined by a number of guards and also a priest who administered him the last rites, next to the stool where he was to be executed upon. The firing squad was gathered, and they all stood in their black uniforms, armed with their rifles. Then Pietro was led over to the chair, where he was secured and tied to it. The stool was placed in a way that Pietro Koch would be shot in the back, which was considered very shameful in military circles, as it was honourable for someone to face their firing squad. But then the firing squad were ordered to get ready, and they readied their weapons before they shot straight into Pietro, killing him instantly. Officials then went to check the execution had been performed successfully, and it had. Pietro Koch was a man whose ruthlessness and brutality was unrivalled inside of Italy, to the point where Benito Mussolini even feared him. The former dictator of Italy then ordered his arrest, as he was concerned that Koch's forces would turn on him. But he was a man who had a history of notoriety, following being ousted out of the army, but he was a hunter who was responsible for the murder and executions of dozens of partisans. Wilhelm Schaefer was born on the 20th of October 1911 inside of a farmer's village, and there was little indication of the beast he would one day become. His father held rather strong nationalistic beliefs and ideas, but after his schooling, Schaefer became a bricklayer. However, due to the issues of the 1920s with the economy, Wilhelm Schaefer lost his job, and he then became unemployed, but he found work inside of his town as a farm worker. But in these financial conditions, many people turned to the radical politics, and hundreds of thousands of people turned specifically towards the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. Hitler was promising the German people many things, including an end to starvation and struggle across the nation, and he also promised to restore national pride following the humiliation of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. Schaefer joined the Nazi Party in 1932, but the following year he went further, and he delved into his ideology further and joined the SS. He was involved in much of the brutality of the SS from early on, and he would spark violence with rival political groups, and he developed a reputation for himself for being a brute. Schaefer then, following this in 1935, was first sent to a concentration camp, and he served inside of Lichtenburg concentration camp. This was only at the time a small site, but was one of the first camps opened, and inside here most of the prisoners were political prisoners, but the SS guards became notorious for their evil, and they would assault and attack inmates regularly, as they possessed different beliefs to them, and many, such as communists, were said to have been staunch enemies of the Nazis. Schaefer inside of Lichtenburg was known to have beaten and abused inmates, and he also took part in the killing of inmates, brutalising them. But following his work at Lichtenburg, he was then sent to Buchenwald concentration camp in 1937, and he remained here for 6 years, through a large chunk of the Second World War. Buchenwald as a concentration camp and imprisonment centre opened years before the Second World War, and to begin with it would hold 8,000 prisoners, but would then grow to a huge extent. The camp was staffed by the SS, with the first commandant, Karl Otto Koch, being actually executed inside of his own camp, as he was sentenced to death for disgracing the SS, and would be shot by a firing squad a week before the Americans liberated the camp. Other evil guards included his wife, Ilse Koch, and other women who regularly administered beatings, and even took lives through hangings and shootings. One guard, Walter Sommer, was known as a hangman, and he even crucified 2 priests upside down, inside of the nearby forests, where many people were executed. The forests became known as the singing forests for the screams that would be heard as prisoners were tortured there. The thing about Buchenwald was the sheer size of the complex, and there were 136 subcamps that served the main site, and it was a place used for armaments production, making of weapons and other vital military equipment for the German war effort. But as mentioned, Buchenwald was a place where the conditions were truly hellish, as prisoners were kept starved and they were forced to conduct hard labour. There were many illnesses and diseases that swept through the camp, and as the inmates were very weak and suffering, disease claimed a lot of lives. There was an extermination through labour policy, as the inmates had to choose between conducting the work and having a small chance of survival, or execution for not working hard enough. There was also human experimentation used at the camp, and further executions were carried out upon Soviet prisoners of war, who were slaughtered inside of the Genichtschussenlager, the next shooting facility. It's said that 56,545 prisoners, at least, died at Buchenwald, but as the war turned against the Germans following the Normandy landings, there would be some hope for these prisoners. Many of the inmates were evacuated on death marches and transports to other camps, and here the SS would execute and shoot anyone who could not keep up and was too slow. Wilhelm Schaefer remained at Buchenwald until 1943, where he took part in much of the horror. He was the deputy commandant of the camp laundry area of the site, but was also a block Führer, responsible for different detachments of prisoners who were forced to conduct hard labour. He was also part of Commando 99, inside of the camp, who performed many executions, including much of the horrors that occurred inside the next shooting facility, with this group of executioners shooting many thousands of Soviet prisoners of war. He took part in hundreds, if not thousands, of executions, and Schaefer also administered torture at the camp, alongside other beasts such as Martin Sommer, who as mentioned became known as the hangman. Schaefer flogged prisoners in the open many times, and he also punished prisoners using tree hangings, where the victims had their hands tied behind their backs, and they were then suspended by them from behind. This was excruciating, and was so painful it even resulted in many deaths and executions. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, and due to a shortage of men, Wilhelm Schaefer was sent to go and fight the enemy in battle, and his unit, the 20th Waffen SS Grenadier Division, conducted many anti-partisan raids. However, when he realised that the war was only going one way, Schaefer made preparations to try and avoid a later war crimes trial. He was a man who knew he would be one day brought to trial for his horrific actions inside of the concentration camps, and he absconded from the front lines. He then cut out his own SS blood tattoo on his arm and burned all of his SS papers and his uniform, and he tried to hide out as a civilian. He moved throughout different German regions before he settled in Arnstadt, and he wrote to his wife, who was in West Germany, saying that he did not want to return to her as he believed he would be identified. But he was inside of East Germany and did not necessarily keep a low profile, becoming the chairman of the local Peasants' Mutual Aid Association. However, in the 1960s, there was an issue in East Germany. Independent farmers were being pushed to collectivise their farms and lands, and farmers based where Schaefer was did not want to do this, and Schaefer himself was opposed to it. However, one day in 1960, a man knocked on the door of Schaefer's home and tried to get him to join collectivised farming. However, unfortunately for Schaefer, this man was in fact a survivor of Buchenwald who went cold when he realised who he was, and this man then reported Schaefer to the Stasi and he was arrested. In 1961, Wilhelm Schaefer was brought to trial and he was accused of being an accessory to murder, was accused of crimes against humanity, mass murder and war crimes, and the case was heard in front of the Supreme Court of East Germany. There was a lot of evidence gathered during the trial, and many witnesses and former prisoners from Buchenwald told the court about Schaefer's World War II conduct inside of the camp. They said he was incredibly brutal, and the prisoners avoided him at all costs, and that he had a habit of executing prisoners when he became bored. But Schaefer would not hide his crimes, and he admitted to executing around 150 Soviet prisoners, and he may have believed that enough time had passed and that he would be reprieved and would be spared the hangman or the guillotine by admitting some of his crimes. But what the court found was much more harrowing. Schaefer was found guilty of brutalising and murdering at Lichtenburg and Buchenwald, and executing 150 prisoners inside the next shooting facility at least, and being involved in the executions of up to more than 1,000 Soviet prisoners of war. He was also found guilty of carrying out 400 floggings, 30 tree hangings, and in raiding partisans during the war as part of the SS, and many of the civilians captured were executed by Schaefer and his SS cronies. He was also guilty of burning down villages and settlements. Because of all of these crimes, Wilhelm Schaefer was condemned to death for his crimes. In West Germany, at the time, a number of Second World War criminals had been released, but it was very different in East Germany, as the Soviet authorities pressed forward with executions. It was said that a life sentence was too lenient because of his horrific crimes, and they argued that Schaefer was still a danger to people. But he was not allowed to appeal his verdict, and following his trial he was sent to Leipzig prison, where he sat on death row. On the 16th of June 1961, he was taken from his prison cell and was marched into the execution chamber of Leipzig prison, where the guillotine was found. During the war and following, the German guillotine, which was known as the Faulbeil, fell upon the heads and necks of many who were known to have committed atrocities during the conflict. In fact, executioners became so swift using the device that they would be able to take a head clean off in a matter of seconds from someone just entering the execution chamber. Wilhelm Schaefer had his identity confirmed, and the assistant executioner secured his arms behind his back before he was then secured onto a metal board. This was then tilted onto the guillotine, and he was locked into place. The executioner then swiftly released the blade, and with this the blade fell and took his head clean off. Wilhelm Schaefer's remains were then cremated. He was one of the most evil and brutal guards of the concentration camp system, but eventually Wilhelm Schaefer paid for his crimes with his head and his life. He was a man who was more than eager to get involved in torture and slaughter inside of Buchenwald, and his actions were etched onto the minds of those who survived the camp, and eventually this would haunt him as he was handed over to the Stasi by a former prisoner. The courtroom was horrified by what Schaefer had done, and his actions were seen as some of the most sadistic of the conflict, and something which the guillotine would try to atone for. Henry Oliver Rinnen was born on the 14th of May 1915 inside of Levanger in Norway, and he was born into a rather poor family. He was the eldest of 8 children, but he did not have the greatest childhood. Rinnen had very few friends, and he spent a lot of his time on his own, but he was known to others later in life because of his size. For a Norwegian man, he was remarkably short, standing at 5 feet 3 inches tall, but following working with his uncle in his business, Rinnen lost his job because he was caught stealing. He was a man who was more than comfortable with stealing from his own family members, and he would have very little remorse for his actions throughout his life. He was a vain but charming man, but following losing his job, he and his wife Clara were then living in a poorhouse. They were not allowed to keep any of their furniture except their bed. He was then employed as a car salesman in Trondheim, and his wife Clara then had their first child. However, Henry Rinnan around this time went on a short trip with another woman and returned home after 2 weeks, and he was also sacked from his job. However, in 1939, he tried to enlist in the Winter War in Finland. However, Rinnan had dentures in his upper mouth, and he was rejected because of this. But following the German invasion that occurred on the 9th of April 1940, he worked as a driver for Norwegian soldiers in Snarsa, but following the German occupation, he then served his enemies. In particular, he enlisted to become a German agent and was recruited to become a member of the Gestapo in June 1940. His parents had been members of pro-German groups, but it's not known if Henry Rinnan also joined these. However, inside of the Gestapo, he was tasked with infiltrating left-wing resistance groups in Trondheim and was working under the codename Fiskvik. Because of his work, around 50 to 60 people found themselves arrested for being communists. But in January 1942, he then recruited another 3 agents to work with him, and because of his work, he was given the rank of an SS Untersturmführer, and his group of spies then became known as the Rinnan Banden. They continued to infiltrate resistance groups, and they also tortured hundreds of people, and it's believed that over 80 people were killed by Rinnan and his men, and it's claimed that he kept strict discipline, and also acted as a judge and executioner in many cases for resistors himself. He has also been described by some as a cynical rat and a scoundrel, and one former worker with him claimed that he did not realise what a monster we had created. He claimed Rinnan had a kind of sixth sense. It was almost as if he could smell danger. The special thing about Rinnan was that he was able to carry out his evil in a system that was created for it. His agents would track people down and then engage them in conversations about their attitudes towards the occupation, and then his agents built trust to infiltrate their networks. But it's claimed that the spies were responsible for at least 100 deaths in the Norwegian resistance and for more than 1,000 arrests. There were plans drawn up to assassinate Rinnan, and British Special Operations Executive had learned about his actions. One man, Sven B. Svensson, had been tasked to kill Rinnan, but he had a lack of weapons to do this at the time. Further plans were drawn up to take him out, and there were a number of attempts to kill him. One, on the 7th of October 1943, did not go as planned, and he managed to escape unharmed, but another member of his torture group was shot and injured. But as the Second World War turned against the Germans, Henry Rinnan tried to make an escape with hostages and some other spies. However, he was taken close to the Swedish border. They hiked towards Sweden in the rough terrain and the snow, and Rinnan did have a new fiancée who was pregnant and struggled. His men wore German soldier uniforms to try and blend in, and on his possession, Rinnan had a huge amount of banknotes and also a gun. His hostages were to be shot, and one managed to escape during a blizzard. However, on the 15th of May 1945, he was found by Norwegian police and was arrested. But he did manage to escape from prison on the 24th of December 1945, and he was going to try and get to the Soviet Union to then work as a Soviet secret agent, but within a few hours he was caught again. He was a man who was hated inside of Norway. When he was brought into the centre of the city, a number of people had gathered, and he refused to get out of the car, and as he was dragged out, many people cheered his arrest. But Rinnan, whilst he was in prison, was beaten badly by the guards, and also by other inmates, and when he was interrogated for the first time, he had very bad bruises on his face, and his eyes were heavily swollen. To get him to confess to information, he was also subjected to mock executions, where he believed he would either be shot or executed. He was heavily investigated for treason, and dozens of deaths were attributed to Henry Rinnan and his group, and they were also linked to sending around 1,000 Norwegians to concentration camps, where many died as soon as they got there. It was said that Rinnan cooperated closely with the Gestapo, and he allowed a number of war criminals to gain their freedom. But in what was known as the Norwegian Treason Settlement, Henry Rinnan, along with 11 others from the Rinnan gang, were sentenced to death. 10 of these would be executed. Specifically, Henry Rinnan was convicted of 13 murders and many more crimes. He was held inside of a prison for a number of years until his execution was finally carried out on the 1st of February 1947. He was to be executed very early in the morning at 4:05 a.m. inside of Christiansand Fortress in Trondheim. During his final days, a priest had been with him to provide him with spiritual guidance as his execution date approached. He was led out to the execution firing range, and a doctor attached a white cardboard disc to Rinan's chest, and the prison priest repeated the words of Jesus to the robber on the cross to him, saying, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me to paradise." The execution squad was led by Lieutenant Sawley, who oversaw the execution. He gave his orders for the firing squad to ready, and they raised their rifles. Rinnan stood emotionless and still, and he had been blindfolded also by a guard when he was tied and secured to the execution post. The order was then given to fire, and immediately the firing squad shot their weapons into him. However, this was not the end of the execution. The leader of the execution squad then approached Rinnan's body, and he pulled out his Mauser pistol, then fired 2 coup de grace gunshots into Rinnan's head at close range into his temple, ensuring that his death had occurred. Straight after the execution, his body was cremated, but there was a slight issue, as his body should not allegedly have been placed in a coffin when he was cremated. His ashes were then buried in an unmarked plot near to his hometown. It was claimed that Henry Rinnan was the most useful non-German that Heinrich Himmler had under his wing inside of Northern Europe, and he claimed he had handed over 5,000 people to the Gestapo to be dealt with. There was some debate following his execution as to what actually happened with it, as some claimed he was actually spotted boarding a plane hours after the execution allegedly took place. But the documentation for the execution clearly shows what happened to the Gestapo spy and informant, and he was ruthlessly shot by a firing squad. Then the leader of the executioners finished him off. Henry Rinnan was a man who was a torturer, a brute, and a barbaric spy and executioner himself, who horrifically betrayed Norway, his nation, in favour of the Nazis.